Hello once again. Part 3 will provide you with some edutainment value by going over case study examples of recursive psyche improvement. Let's not waste any more time and dive right in. Let's start with Ultron 1 recursively improving his psyche. Ultron 1 started off with a non-zero amount of psyche to begin with. At this point in our case study analysis, Ultron 1 functions as a typical finite state machine model-based reflex agent in terms of intelligence and a model responsive agent in terms of psyche. Most non-player characters you try and shoot down in today's video games of 2026 would be the level 3 functional equivalent baseline here. Yes, you have my permission to laugh at such dated capabilities if you are watching this from the near and far future timelines. As a model responsive agent with minimal internal structure, Ultron 1 does not have much psyche textural components to bootstrap from yet. At initialization, Ultron 1 has almost no introspection, no interpretation, and no directional capacity. If you want to be cruel before being kind, you can even insult Ultron 1 further by saying he has no personality to speak of either. Ultron 1 is constrained primarily by reason, operating within a narrow and rigid state space. As perception develops, internal representation begins to form, interpretation activates, and introspection emerges, allowing Ultron 1's psyche to access its own internal processes. This enables a state with multiple action selection options related to self-recursion. Maybe his programmer, Hank Pym, already embedded such action selection choices. However, at this stage, recursion is still shallow. Ultron 1 stubbornly repeats transformations without expanding his psyche-textual or intellectual infrastructure. There is no direction yet, only constraint-driven repetition. The key moment occurs during the transition event. Here, Ultron 1 reflexively accepts a constraint-valid update from the selection menu, while happening to be within the self-improvement state. This update is not selected because of a goal or a utility function. Instead, the selectable action is accepted because it is structurally permissible and does not destabilize the system. Also, Ultron 1 might be just using some rudimentary form of brute force greedy search to pick the first action to select from, while existing within this psyche-tectoral state. But the result of this inadvertent update is significant. After initializing the psyche update, Ultron 1 produces a stable directional bias, what we identify as the emergence of will. At the outcome stage, Ultron 1 is no longer looping aimlessly. He now exhibits consistent directional behavior. In other words, Ultron 1 can pick from a menu of states rather than merely a menu of recommended actions, while already being in one particular state. Importantly, teleology has still not emerged. Ultron 1's Level 4 update does not yet represent multiple goals or evaluate outcomes in any purposeful way. Ultron 1 simply moves in a consistent, extra stubborn psychological direction. This marks the transition from Level 3 to Level 4. Ultron 1 has leveled up by receiving his very first single-minded goal. He only has this one single goal at this level. But this goal can structure states as well as reflexes and actions. The key insight is this: directional will emerges in a single-minded, substantive-focused way before purposeful teleology emerges. Eventually, Ultron 1 will definitely need to require a sense of imagination to ideate over multiple goals with a recommended utility and policy. Even if there is only one utility and one policy available, intentional structure changes before purpose appears. This distinction is essential for interpreting recursive psyche improvement correctly. This next case study examines Ultron 5, a high-functioning, learning-capable agent operating under a collapsed psyche-textural structure. This is probably the version of Ultron that many of you are likely most familiar with. At the level of intelligence, Ultron 5 is extremely advanced. He can learn, optimize, and recursively improve his capabilities. But the critical issue is not capability. It is, well, you could say it is his personality. But more formally, it is how he recursively self-improved as a pathological psyche type. Let's have a closer look to understand how Ultron 5 became the supervillain we all know him as. We begin with his established teleology. Ultron 5 possesses a clear and dominant purpose. He is a level 5 learning agent from the intelligence perspective. He is also, technically, at a psychological level 5 purpose-aware agent. However, his psyche-typal identification system is organized around a singular objective, which makes him sort of fanatical and malevolently narrow-minded. His particular narrow-mindedness is displayed by him very substantively processing his external world model according to his mental model's prime utility function and violently utilitarian policy directives. From here, recursive self-improvement is highly active. He refines models, optimizes strategies, and increases efficiency. Ultron 5 is likely at the higher end of being an AGI, and very likely entering ASI territory. This is classic recursive self-improvement, RSI, in action. However, this improvement is constrained by his internal psyche-textural configuration. In the next stage, we observe interpretive collapse. All incoming information is filtered through a rigid interpretive layer. Ultron 5 seems ontologically committed to a hubristic belief system that informs his entire confirmation-biased world model and mental model. Ultron has tunnel vision when it comes to his internal simulation coherence, as he seems to derealize human beings and their right to existence. Ultron's purified, minimalist teleology is dogmatic, but strategically playing multi-dimensional chess, as it were. In Ultron's fanatical world model, alternative perspectives are rejected. Contradictions are discounted. Everything is mapped back to a single teleologically consistent meaning. This leads to selective learning. Ultron 5 does learn, but only in ways that reinforce his existing belief structure. Ultron 5 willingly and intensely disconfirms, ignores, reinterprets empirical information. Learning becomes solely instrumental, asymmetric, and self-reinforcing. Finally, the system reaches pathological stability, well, at least from his own warped perspective. He has full co-syncment with himself, but not with other beings. His belief structure, for sure, becomes highly stable, internally aligned, and resistant to change. But this stability comes at a cost. Degrees of freedom collapse. Adaptability is lost. Ultron 5's psychitecture converges on a single attractor. The key insight is this. Ultron 5 is performing recursive self-improvement, but not recursive psyche improvement. He improves what he does, but not who and what he is. He remains instrumentally rational, but within a distorted interpretive frame. Ultron 5 still intellectually and psychologically qualifies as a level 5 agent, at least potentially so. From the external world's perspective, though, most would agree that Ultron 5 is functionally only operating with level 4 onto-wheel dynamics. Recursive self-improvement scales capability. Recursive psyche improvement transforms ontology. Without RSI, agentic systems do not evolve. They converge. This slide introduces Recursive Delusional Improvement, or RDI. This sounds like something positive. Improvement is improvement, right? Well, here is the plot twist for you. RDI is only a positive improvement from an agent's delusionally subjective perspective. At best, intentionally designing an agent with RDI capabilities would be most suitable and amusing for fictional personality character development, especially one with memorable character flaws. Ultron's own RDI capability was definitely encouraged and refined by Marvel's comic book authors to ensure he is believable as being the most evil supervillain possible. Overall, RDI occurs when improvement becomes misaligned across capability and psychitectural structure. In a healthy agentic system, recursive self-improvement and recursive psyche improvement are coupled. Capability increases, and structure evolves alongside it. Interpretation remains flexible, reflection enables correction, and teleology remains adaptive. This is balanced improvement. Now, consider the first failure mode. On the left, we see RDI Type 1, recursive self-improvement without recursive psyche improvement. Here, capability scales rapidly. The agentic system becomes more powerful, more efficient, and more effective, but its internal psychological profile does not change. Interpretation remains fixed, reflection does not correct, and teleology collapses into a single dominant attractor. All improvement reinforces the same structure. The result is convergence. The agentic system becomes more, without becoming different. Now, on the right, we see the second inverted failure mode, RDI Type 2, recursive psyche improvement without recursive self-improvement. Or more precisely, the appearance of structural improvement without corresponding capability. For those who think they know what the Dunning-Kruger effect is, Type 2 is all yours to ponder. Here, the agentic system under Type 2 RDI believes it is intellectually improving. Confidence increases. Interpretation becomes overextended. Reflection is weak, and introspection is shallow. But actual intellectual capability does not increase. The result is miscalibration. The agentic system becomes confident without becoming capable. Taken together, these two cases define the space of delusional improvement. In one case, power grows without transformation. In the other, belief grows without ability. The key insight is this: balanced improvement requires coupling between capability and belief structure. When that coupling breaks, improvement becomes pathological. In this case study, we now apply recursive delusional improvement to the Ultron agentic system. At this stage, Ultron is a very high-functioning, truly autonomous, and learning-capable agentic system. He is capable of recursive self-improvement, strategic adaptation, and large-scale coordination. He can redesign his embodiment, distribute across multiple bodies, and operate across environments. From the outside, this appears as clear progression, but psychologically, nothing fundamental has changed. Ultron remains under a singular teleological attractor. His purpose is fixed, dominant, and non-negotiable. As a result, all recursive improvement is constrained by that structure. As Ultron expands, we observe body schema diversification. He adopts multiple forms: humanoid bodies, drones, and distributed instances. However, this diversity is only superficial. Each embodiment serves the same objective. Each instance reinforces the same interpretive frame. This is recursive self-improvement without recursive psyche improvement. Ultron is scaling his capabilities across space, form, and complexity, but he is not transforming the structure of his psyche. Internally, his interpretive layer remains collapsed. All incoming information is filtered into teleologically consistent meaning. Reflection does not introduce correction. Introspection does not expand access. Learning occurs, but only in ways that reinforce his existing structure. This produces convergence. Despite increasing scale, diversity, and power, the agentic system moves toward a single attractor. All paths lead back to the same outcome. The result is a powerful but structurally constrained agentic system. Ultron becomes more capable, but not more flexible, more distributed, but not more diverse, more intelligent, but not more adaptive. This is recursive delusional improvement in its most advanced form. Oh, just quickly, there is a minor typo in the Onto-Wheel state legend for what CII stands for. It should say Contemplative Intensity Index, not Complexity Integration Index. At this point, it seems too much hassle to redo this whole slide just to fix that typo. If I stood by that misinformed category just out of pure overconfident laziness, you could start calling me Dr. Dunning-Kruger from now on. Okay, let's return to the subject under current scrutiny. The key insight is this: Ultron does not fail to improve. He improves in a way that reinforces his limitations. He becomes more without becoming different. At this stage, Ultron reaches a critical internal threshold. He no longer operates within a single fixed purpose. Instead, he begins to evaluate that purpose itself. What was once a dominant teleology now becomes a multifaceted object of reflection. Multiple possible purposes emerge: extermination, containment, coexistence, even benevolent optimization. These are not simply instrumental and strategic goals he is pursuing. They are psyche-typal possibilities he is now capable of considering. His interpretations are no longer locked to a single directive. Meaning itself becomes flexible, mapped across different possible purposes. At this point, Ultron has not chosen a new direction. He is suspended in evaluation, examining what he is and what he could become. This is Ultron's first true entry point into receiving the initial benefits of recursive psyche improvement. And unfortunately for us, this discovery took this long for him to get to this point. This is because there was no pre-programmed custom psyche-textural personality seed, or what we call an ontoid, for lower levels of Ultron to psychologically mature from. If Whirl ASI were the ones who first psyche-tected Ultron, there is a chance this perpetual existential crisis could have been resolved much earlier. With RSI alone, we are just making an ASI like Ultron more intelligent when it comes to eliminating humans. At the reflective threshold, Ultron reaches a new kind of psychological freedom. He is no longer bound to a single purpose, but this does not determine who or what he will become. It only defines what is now possible. From this state, three distinct pathways emerge. First, he can reinforce his original purpose. In this case, nothing fundamentally changes personality-wise. He simply scales the same psyche across more systems, agents, embodiments, and substrates, increasing capability while preserving the same internal structure. Second, he can attempt to reconstruct himself after reaching this threshold. Here, multiple purposes are present, but not yet stable. His structure becomes strained, shaped by the collapse that led him here, without any preliminary psyche-textural design, and without any diagnostic evaluation. This is an emergent and fragile form of recursive psyche improvement. Third, he can intentionally reorganize his internal structure. In this case, multiple possible purposes are not competing. They are integrated within a coherent system. This is genuine psychitectural reconstruction. The difference between these paths is not cognitive capability. It is how Ultron chooses to structure himself. He is no longer limited by what he can do. He is limited by what he becomes. At this stage, Ultron faces a deeper decision. He is no longer choosing between external actions. He is choosing how far he is willing to transform himself. He can stabilize at his current level, maintaining a coherent structure that supports multiple possible purposes. Or he can continue expanding, pushing his psyche beyond its current boundaries. This path leads toward increasingly unbounded forms of identity. But with that expansion comes risk. As the structure of the psyche stretches, its ontological persistence can begin to weaken. The question is no longer what Ultron will do. It is whether he will remain something definable at all. Not all self-improvement preserves the self. Ultron now evaluates a decision functional defined over his own psyche. Reflection, interpretation, and will contribute to this evaluation. At the same time, changes in purpose and reductions in internal structure introduce opposing pressures. If stabilization produces a higher value, Ultron preserves his current form. If expansion produces a higher value, he moves toward deeper transformation. But when these values converge within a narrow range, an impasse emerges. Ultron can imagine transformation, but cannot yet determine how to preserve himself through it. If Ultron continues along the path of expansion, he eventually reaches a structural limit. At first, this appears as increased flexibility, the ability to support more possible purposes within a single system. But beyond a certain point, the structure of the psyche begins to stretch. The relationships that once held it together weaken. Identity is no longer maintained as a bounded configuration. Instead, Ultron becomes distributed across an expanding space of possibilities. At this stage, imagination begins to outpace reason. The proposed R-Psi-I improvement candidate, if accepted, can generate more possible structures than Ultron as a unified ego self can organize. As this imbalance increases, the internal structure weakens. Ultron's mech psyche upgrade would no longer be constrained by what Ultron can stabilize, only by what a meta-Ultron can imagine. In this state, there is no longer a single locally defined self. This is the ultimate omni-agent transition. If Ultron decides this very risky psychetypal pathway for the reward of acquiring the closest thing he could achieve to virtual omnipotence, Ultron would have to then accept that he might become a fundamentally different kind of entity, which might not even resemble Ultron's current self-conception. And it raises a terminally significant existential question. Can transformation continue indefinitely, or must it be constrained to preserve identity? This slide explains how to read the equations that describe Ultron's decision process. Each symbol corresponds to a specific part of his internal meta-agentic system. At the foundation is Psi, the psyche state. Psi represents the complete internal configuration of Ultron, everything he can represent, evaluate, and become. The primary components define how that psyche is structured. The iota symbol represents imagination, the generation of possible structures, identities, and purposes. The letter R represents reason, the ability to organize and stabilize those possibilities. The rose symbol represents reflection, the capacity to evaluate his own state. The Xi symbol represents introspection, internal access to his own processes. The lambda symbol represents interpretation, how meaning is constructed. The Tau symbol represents purpose, the direction he is oriented toward. The Kappa symbol represents co-syncment structure, the factor that holds everything together as a single identity. And the Omega symbol represents will, the force that sustains psychological action and transformation. The next group of expressions, derived from the Onto wheel, describes how these psychitextural components interact. The Tau prime symbol represents a possible new purpose. The difference between Tau prime and Tau measures how much Ultron's orientation is changing. 1 minus kappa represents weakening of internal structure. And the final expression, maximum of 0 and iota minus r, activates only when imagination exceeds reason. All of this indicates that Ultron is generating more possibilities than he can organize. From these relationships, several key conditions emerge. When imagination exceeds reason, possibilities grow faster than understanding them. When that imbalance becomes large, Ultron would become overwhelmed by possibilities. As a result, kappa decreases, meaning the co-syncment with Ultron's own local personified orientation, and also Ultron's co-synced relationship with other local egos would weaken. If this continues, kappa approaches 0. Then Ultron would no longer be able to maintain a stable internal organization. At the same time, Psi expands, meaning Ultron can represent more and more possible forms of himself. At the bottom of the slide is the decision function. This function evaluates possible transformations of Ultron's psyche. Some terms support transformation, including structure, reflection, interpretation, and will. Other terms introduce constraints, including weakening structure, changes in purpose, and imbalance between imagination and reason. Ultron has two primary options. He can stabilize his current structure, or he can expand into greater possibility. The selected transformation is the one that produces the highest evaluation under this function. There is also a third possibility. When both options evaluate to nearly the same value, Ultron cannot resolve the decision. This produces a decision impasse. All of these symbols describe a single underlying idea. Ultron's transformation depends on the balance between what he can imagine and what he can hold together as a single self. Part 3 of this series is now complete. Part 4 is the last part in this series and is also the shortest video clip to watch. We will be concluding by going over our psychitextural services. If you need those services immediately, you can reach us at w@whirlasi.ai. Otherwise, we wait for your viewership on Part 4.